What happens when you give one man everything? I don't just mean wealth, or a title, or a corner office with a view. I mean everything. The power of life and death over millions. A treasury that can fund any whim, no matter how extravagant. The command of the most terrifying army the world has ever known. And the belief, whispered first by others, and then screamed by himself, that he is no longer a man, but a god. Welcome, history lovers, to the full history of the Roman Empire. Today, we are descending into the darkest, strangest, and most unsettling corridors of the imperial palace. We are going to look at what happens when the immense pressure of absolute power doesn't just corrupt the soul, but shatters the mind. This is our countdown of the top 5 craziest Roman emperors. Now, the word crazy is a simple one, but the stories we're about to tell are anything but. We'll journey through reigns defined by divine megalomania, breathtaking cruelty, and acts so bizarre they sound like fever dreams. We're talking about men who declared war on the sea, who appointed their horse to high office, who turned the Roman court into a den of debauchery that would make a rock star blush, and who drenched the gleaming marble of the Capitol in the blood of their closest friends and family. But here, at the full history of the Roman Empire, we do more than just list the shocking tales. We dig deeper. We have to remember that our history of these men was written almost exclusively by their enemies, by the senators they terrorized and humiliated. So our job is to be detectives, to sift through the propaganda, to find the kernel of truth in the myth, and to ask the most important question of all. Were these emperors truly insane? Or was their madness a terrifyingly rational tool of power, a calculated performance designed to keep an entire empire in a state of perpetual fear? The answer is complex, and it changes with each man on our list. So steel yourselves. We begin our countdown with the emperor who wrote the playbook on imperial insanity, a man whose name has become a synonym for depraved tyranny, a man who started as a beloved savior and ended as a monster, cut down in a dark tunnel by his own guards. Our number 5 spot goes to the one, the only, Caligula. His name wasn't actually Caligula. That was a childhood nickname. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, and if you wanted to design a perfect imperial heir in a lab, you couldn't have done better. His father was Germanicus, the most beloved general, and his great-grandfather was Augustus. But his childhood was not one of palaces. He grew up on the military frontier, amongst the legions who adored his father. It was there they gave him his nickname, Caligula, meaning little boots. He was their mascot, their little prince. But that world came crashing down. His heroic father died suddenly, likely poisoned. His mother and 2 older brothers were arrested, exiled, and systematically destroyed by the paranoid, brooding Emperor Tiberius. Young Gaius, the last surviving son, was summoned to the island of Capri, a place that was less an imperial retreat and more a gilded prison. For years he lived under the shadow of Tiberius, a man who had murdered his entire family. He had to learn to hide every emotion, to play the sycophant, to smile while his heart was filled with terror and rage. Imagine the psychological damage. Every day was a test. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and he would have joined his brothers in a shallow, unmarked grave. So when Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, and the 24-year-old Caligula was proclaimed emperor, Rome didn't just rejoice, it erupted in pure, unadulterated ecstasy. The dark days were over. The son of Germanicus, their beloved little boot, had come to save them. Suetonius tells us that over 160,000 sacrificial animals were slaughtered in the first 3 months of his reign in celebration. He was, they called him, our baby and our star, and for a time he was everything they had hoped for. He was a dream come true. He gave bonuses to the military, he abolished the hated treason trials of Tiberius, he burned incriminating records in the Forum for all to see, and he staged the most lavish and spectacular gladiatorial games and chariot races the city had ever witnessed. He was generous, he was charismatic, he was the golden boy. The entire Roman world breathed a collective sigh of relief. It lasted 7 months. Then, in October of 37 AD, Caligula fell gravely ill. We don't know what it was. A fever, encephalitis, epilepsy. Historians have debated it for centuries. The entire empire held its breath, praying for his recovery. And he did recover. He rose from his sickbed. But the man who rose was not the same man who had fallen ill. It was as if the sickness had burned away the charming, rational young man and left behind something else, something twisted, monstrous, and utterly unpredictable. The reign of Gaius was over. The reign of Caligula had begun. The first sign that something was deeply wrong was the money. The vast treasury that Tiberius had carefully accumulated, Caligula began to spend with a kind of manic glee, as if money itself were his personal enemy. He built 2 gigantic, opulent pleasure barges for himself on the tiny Lake Nemi. These weren't just boats, they were floating palaces, complete with marble floors, heating and plumbing systems, and priceless works of art. But that was nothing compared to his most infamous project, the pontoon bridge of Baiae. A soothsayer had once prophesied that Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Gulf of Baiae. So having become emperor, Caligula decided to literally fulfill the second part of that prophecy, just to prove he could defy fate itself. He ordered the confiscation of thousands of merchant ships from across the Mediterranean, causing a grain shortage and famine in the process. He had these ships anchored in a double line across the 2 miles of open sea between Baiae and Puteoli. For 2 days, Caligula held a bizarre festival on this bridge. On the first day, he rode back and forth on his favorite horse, Incitatus, wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great. On the second day, he staged a chariot race with his friends. It was a spectacle of unimaginable expense and absurdity. It served no purpose other than to scream to the world, "I am Caligula. I can tame the very ocean. Your prophecies, your gods, your logic, they mean nothing to me." This was the dawning of his central obsession, his own divinity. Now Roman emperors were often deified after their death, but Caligula couldn't wait. He demanded to be worshipped as a living, breathing god, a present god, a deus praesens. He began appearing in public dressed as various gods and goddesses. He had the heads of famous statues of gods, including the colossal statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, removed and replaced with likenesses of his own head. He built a bridge connecting his palace on the Palatine Hill directly to the temple of Jupiter, so he could, as he claimed, go and have private consultations with his fellow god. He would stand there, whispering to the statue, and then cock his ear as if listening for a reply. He even established his own temple with his own priests, including, bizarrely, his horse. Ah, yes, the horse, Incitatus. This is the story everyone knows about Caligula, the ultimate symbol of his madness, and the reality is almost as strange as the myth. Incitatus had a stable made of marble, a manger of ivory, a jeweled collar, and blankets of the richest purple dye. He was attended by a retinue of slaves. He was invited to formal dinners where he was served oats mixed with gold flakes. Now, did Caligula actually make his horse a consul, the highest political office in Rome? The historical record says no, but our source, Suetonius, claims that he said he was going to, and that threat was the entire point. Imagine being a proud Roman senator, and the emperor is telling you to your face that his horse is more qualified. It was the ultimate act of political humiliation. It wasn't just madness, it was a cruel, targeted, and terrifyingly effective insult. And the cruelty only grew. His favorite phrase, when signing execution orders, was, "Make him feel that he is dying." He took a perverse pleasure in forcing fathers to watch the executions of their own sons. He once complained during a game that the day was dull because there had been no major executions. The whispers in the palace grew darker. They spoke of incest with his 3 sisters, especially his beloved Drusilla, whom he treated as his wife and deified as a goddess upon her death. Whether this was true or just slander, designed to make him seem monstrous, we'll never know for sure. His reign reached its theatrical, absurd climax in 40 AD, when he announced a grand military campaign to finally conquer Britannia. He marched the legions all the way to the northern coast of Gaul, to the shores of the English Channel. He did not order them to invade. He ordered them to unsheathe their swords, charge down to the water's edge, and attack the ocean. Then he commanded them to gather seashells, which he called the spoils of the sea, as the loot from their great victory. The soldiers, baffled and humiliated, filled their helmets with shells. But you cannot rule the most powerful empire on earth this way for long. You cannot humiliate senators, bankrupt the state, and mock your own soldiers indefinitely. An emperor needs the support of the men who carry swords right next to him. And Caligula had finally pushed his own bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard, too far. The leader of the conspiracy was a Praetorian officer named Cassius Chaerea, a man Caligula relentlessly mocked for his high-pitched voice, forcing the grizzled old soldier to use humiliating, effeminate passwords. On January 24th, 44 AD, after a day at the games, Caligula was walking through a dark, secluded underground corridor of the palace. It was there that Chaerea and the other conspirators cornered him. Chaerea struck the first blow. As the wounded emperor staggered, he looked at his assassin and snarled his last words, "Hoc age! Do your duty!" They did. The conspirators swarmed him. His madness was met with a final, brutal violence. In the chaos that followed, his wife and infant daughter were also lost. Caligula ruled for less than 4 years. 4 years that started with so much light and ended in such profound and bloody darkness. So what is the verdict on our first mad emperor? Was he a victim of a brain-altering illness? Was he a deeply traumatized young man who cracked under the weight of absolute power? Or was he a shrewd and sadistic tyrant who understood that the greatest weapon is fear, generated through calculated, unpredictable, and seemingly insane behavior? The truth, as always, is likely a tangled mess of all 3. Caligula remains a chilling testament to the fact that when the most powerful man in the world loses his grip on reality, he can drag the entire world down into the nightmare with him. And believe me, the story only gets stranger from here. Caligula showed us what happens when a mind, perhaps already damaged, is shattered by sickness and absolute power. His was a reign of theatrical, almost abstract insanity, a war on the ocean, conversations with statues. It was the madness of a man trying to bend reality itself to his will. But what if the madness isn't a sudden storm? What if it's a slow rot? What if it's not born from trauma or sickness, but from privilege? What happens when you take the son of the wisest, most noble and most respected emperor in Roman history, and he turns out to be a spoiled, violent, egotistical monster? This brings us to number 4 on our list of the craziest Roman emperors, a man who was the living, breathing embodiment of disappointment. A man who saw the awesome responsibility of the purple toga not as a sacred duty, but as a ticket to his own personal fantasy camp. A man who wanted to be a hero so badly, he decided to play one in real life, with real blood. Let's talk about the gladiator emperor, Commodus. To understand the tragedy of Commodus, you must first understand the miracle he represented. For the better part of a century, Rome had been ruled by the 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and finally, Marcus Aurelius, the father of Commodus. None of these men had a biological son to succeed them. Each one, therefore, adopted the most capable, most worthy man he could find to be his heir. This system, based on merit, not blood, had given Rome an unprecedented era of stability and prosperity, its absolute golden age. Marcus Aurelius was the pinnacle of this system. He was the philosopher king made real. While commanding the legions on the frigid Danube frontier, fighting brutal wars to protect the empire, he spent his nights in his tent writing his famous Meditations, a masterpiece of Stoic philosophy about duty, self-control, and cosmic order. He was everything a Roman emperor was supposed to be: brave, thoughtful, dutiful, and reluctant to hold power. And he had a son, a healthy, handsome son named Commodus. The curse of hereditary succession was broken. For the first time in nearly 100 years, an emperor's natural son would inherit the world. The succession was secure. The future of Rome was safe. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, everything. Commodus grew up not in a gilded prison like Caligula, but in the shadow of his perfect father. He spent his youth at the military camps on the German frontier. He was made co-emperor at the tender age of 16. He was given every advantage, every lesson, every opportunity to learn from the best man in the empire. But it seems the lessons of Stoic duty, of self-restraint and service to the state, never really stuck. The whole time, Commodus was just waiting for the old man to die so the party could start. In 180 AD, it happened. Marcus Aurelius died in his camp near the Danube, likely from the plague. His dying wish was for his son to finish the job, to see the war through to its conclusion and secure the Roman frontier for generations. It was a war they were on the cusp of winning. Commodus listened to his father's final command and ignored it completely. Within weeks, he had patched together a hasty, unfavorable peace treaty with the Germanic tribes, declared victory, and rushed back to Rome as fast as he could. He abandoned his father's life's work for one reason. He was bored. The cold, mud, and discipline of the frontier held no appeal. He craved the adulation, the luxury, and the debauchery of the capital. And now, there was no one left to tell him no. This was the first, monumental sign that Commodus was not his father's son. Marcus Aurelius saw being emperor as the ultimate burden. Commodus saw it as the ultimate prize. Back in Rome, he left the tedious business of actually running the empire to a series of powerful and corruptible deputies. First, his Praetorian prefect, Perennis, then his chamberlain, a freed slave named Cleander. While they managed the state, Enriching themselves in the process, Commodus dedicated himself to his true passions, indulging every physical appetite he possessed. The ancient sources, particularly Cassius Dio, who was a senator and lived through the reign, paint a lurid picture. They say he kept a harem of 300 women and 300 young men, collected from across the empire for their beauty. His banquets were legendary for their excess. But this was standard, almost boring imperial decadence. The unique madness of Commodus was centered on a much deeper, more personal obsession. He didn't just want to be an emperor. He wanted to be a physical specimen, a champion, a god of muscle and might. He became obsessed with the mythological hero Hercules. This wasn't just admiration. It was a full-blown identity crisis. He began styling himself as the Roman Hercules. He had statues commissioned depicting him in the guise of the hero, complete with a lion-skin cloak and a club. He even demanded that the Senate officially bestow these titles upon him. He renamed a month of the year after Hercules. This was a man so insecure in his own identity as emperor that he needed to cosplay as a mythical strongman. And for Commodus, cosplay wasn't enough. He had to perform his heroism, which led him to his ultimate transgression, the act that scandalized Roman society to its core. He decided to become a gladiator. It is almost impossible for us to comprehend how shocking this was. The Colosseum was the heart of Rome, but the men who fought in it were the absolute lowest rung of society. They were slaves, condemned criminals, and social outcasts. They were simultaneously idolized for their bravery and despised for their status. For an emperor, the sacred, dignified embodiment of Roman majesty, the pater patriae, the father of the fatherland, to voluntarily step onto the sands of the arena and fight as a gladiator was an act of supreme degradation. It was a repudiation of everything the office of emperor stood for. But Commodus didn't care. He loved it. He loved the roar of the crowd, the feel of the sword in his hand, the adulation he could command, not through statesmanship, but through brute force. Of course, none of it was real. His fights were a complete sham. He would enter the arena dressed in fine silks, fighting with gilded weapons. His opponents were either terrified professional gladiators, ordered to lose under penalty of death, or wounded soldiers and amputees dragged from the hospital. He would heroically dispatch these helpless men before a cheering, captive audience. It was a pathetic, bloody theater of ego. His other specialty was slaughtering animals. He was an excellent archer, and he would stand on a protected platform, safely out of harm's way, and kill thousands of exotic beasts. And the final insult? He charged the Roman state for his appearances. He billed the treasury an astronomical 1,000,000 sesterces, a fortune, every time he stepped into the arena. He was bankrupting his own empire to pay himself for his grotesque hobby. The ego trip reached its crescendo in 192 AD. Commodus, no longer content with just being Hercules, decided to remake Rome in his own image. He officially renamed the city of Rome itself. It was now to be called Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He didn't stop there. The Roman legions were renamed the Commodian legions. The Senate became the Commodian Fortunate Senate, and he wiped the calendar clean, renaming all 12 months after his own various names and titles. He was attempting to erase 1,000 years of history and replace it with himself. This was the final straw. For the elites of Rome, this was madness. The end, when it came, was swift and sordid. A conspiracy formed in the heart of his own palace, led by his praetorian prefect, his chamberlain, and, most intimately, his favorite mistress, a woman named Marcia. On New Year's Eve of 192 AD, Marcia served him a glass of poisoned wine. Commodus drank it, but his years of heavy drinking and indulgence had given him a strong constitution. He became nauseous and vomited most of the poison up. The conspirators panicked. If he survived, they were all dead men. So they moved to Plan B. They summoned his personal trainer and wrestling partner, a robust athlete named Narcissus. They promised him a huge reward. Narcissus entered the emperor's chambers, where Commodus was recovering in his bath. And there, in the water, the wrestler did what countless gladiators and wild beasts could never do. He pounced on the emperor and strangled him to death. The mighty Roman Hercules, the self-proclaimed god of strength, was killed, naked and helpless, by his own sparring partner. His death extinguished the Antonine dynasty and plunged the Roman Empire into a brutal civil war, known as the Year of the Five Emperors. The golden age that his father had so carefully maintained was well and truly over. Commodus didn't just destroy himself, he broke the empire. The next emperor on our list makes Commodus's ego and Caligula's tantrums look like child's play. We've met Caligula, the theatrical tyrant, and Commodus, the narcissist in a gladiator's sandals. Both were terrifying. Both were unhinged. But both, in their own twisted ways, were fundamentally Roman. They were products of the system they sought to dominate and defile. Their madness operated within a Roman context. They broke Roman rules, insulted Roman traditions, and were ultimately killed by Roman daggers. Our number 3 emperor is something else entirely. He was not a product of Rome, but an antibody to it. His madness wasn't a corruption of the Roman system. It was an attempt to burn that system to the ground and replace it with something so profoundly alien, so utterly bizarre to the Roman mind, that it almost defies belief. This is not the story of a politician or a general. This is the story of a teenage priest-king from the mystical East who was accidentally handed the most powerful empire on earth and tried to force it to worship his strange rock god. Prepare yourselves for the reign of Elagabalus. To even understand how this could happen, we have to go back to the chaotic aftermath of Commodus. The Severan dynasty that followed was a time of powerful military emperors, but it was also a time run by a cabal of brilliant, ruthless, and politically savvy Syrian women, chief among them Julia Maesa, sister of the former empress. In 218 AD, the throne was occupied by an emperor named Macrinus, a man who had murdered the previous one, Caracalla. Julia Maesa, exiled to her hometown of Emesa in Syria, saw her chance. She had a grandson, a handsome, charismatic 14-year-old boy named Varius Avitus Bassianus. Crucially, this boy was the hereditary high priest of the local sun god, Elagabalus, a powerful and ancient deity worshipped in the form of a large, black, conical meteorite. Julia Maesa, a master of propaganda, started a rumor. She claimed her grandson wasn't just a priest, he was the secret, illegitimate son of the murdered and still popular emperor Caracalla. She then snuck the boy into a nearby legionary camp. The soldiers, loyal to their old commander's memory and enticed by a massive amount of gold, looked at the boy, believed the lie, and proclaimed him emperor. After a short, decisive battle, Macrinus was defeated and killed, and so the 14-year-old priest from Emesa became the undisputed ruler of the Roman world. Rome waited with bated breath for its new leader. They were getting, they thought, a new Severan, another military man to restore order. What they got was a shock to the system so profound it left the city reeling. His first act was to send a portrait of himself to be hung in the Senate House. This was traditional, but the portrait was not of a Roman emperor, in a toga or armor. It showed a boy dressed in flowing, silken, oriental robes, adorned with necklaces, bracelets, and a jewel-encrusted tiara. His eyes were lined with kohl, his cheeks rouged. The senators, men who valued stoic, masculine simplicity above all else, were horrified. This was not an emperor. This was a decadent foreign priest, and it was only the beginning. When Elagabalus, as he now insisted on being called, after his god, finally made his grand entrance into Rome, he didn't come alone. He brought his god with him. The black stone of Emesa, carried on a chariot adorned with gold and gems, was paraded through the streets. The emperor himself walked backwards in front of it, dancing and burning incense, his eyes fixed on the rock, oblivious to the city he was supposed to be ruling. For the people of Rome, this was incomprehensible. Their emperors were Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion. But they served the gods of Rome. They didn't bring their own strange god with them and place it above all others. But that was exactly Elagabalus's plan. He had no interest in Roman politics, the Roman military, or Roman administration. He had one all-consuming obsession: a religious revolution. His goal was not just to add his god, Elagabal, to the Roman pantheon. His goal was to make Elagabal the new supreme god of the entire empire, to utterly supplant the mighty Jupiter Optimus Maximus, who had been the king of the gods for 1,000 years. He began his project with a theological bulldozer. He built a magnificent new temple on the Palatine Hill, the most sacred ground in Rome, and called it the Elagabalium. This was to be the new center of the universe. Then, in an act of breathtaking sacrilege, he ordered all the most sacred objects of Roman religion to be forcibly removed from their ancient shrines and moved into his temple. The eternal flame of Vesta, the sacred shields from the sky, the Palladium itself, the holy statue said to have been rescued from Troy and which guaranteed Rome's survival. He gathered them all under one roof, not to honor them, but to make them servants of his rock. The rituals he performed were equally alien. He would appear on the temple's altar at dawn in his silken robes and perform ecstatic dances to the sound of drums, cymbals, and pipes. He would sacrifice hecatombs, hundreds of bulls and sheep at a time, the blood flowing in rivers down the Palatine. And the darkest rumors, spread by horrified senators like our main source, Cassius Dio, claimed he engaged in human sacrifice, kidnapping the children of noble families to inspect their entrails for omens, while almost certainly propaganda, the fact that people believed it, shows how utterly terrifying and foreign his practices seemed. His next act was perhaps the most surreal. He declared that his god needed a wife. So, he orchestrated a sacred marriage. First, he broke into the temple of Vesta and had the sacred statue of Pallas Athena, a virgin goddess, brought to his temple to be wed to his rock. The city was aghast. When that pairing didn't seem to take, he had the statue of a Carthaginian goddess, Tanit, shipped all the way from Africa, and married her to his god instead, demanding the people of Rome pay a dowry. And while he was marrying his god off, he was engaging in his own series of scandalous unions. In just 4 years, he had 5 wives. The most offensive of these was his marriage to a Vestal virgin named Aquilia Severa. The 6 Vestals were the most sacred women in Rome, sworn to 30 years of absolute chastity. For a Vestal to break her vow was a capital crime, punishable by being buried alive. For the emperor, the Pontifex Maximus himself, to not only take one as a wife, but to pluck her from her sacred duty, was an unthinkable act of religious pollution. His justification? He told the Senate with a straight face that it was fitting for him, a high priest, to marry a high priestess, so that they might have God-like children. But the religious scandals were only half the story. The other half revolved around Elagabalus's personal life and his complete rejection of Roman concepts of gender and sexuality. Cassius Dio, who saw him in the Senate, describes him in meticulous and frankly venomous detail. He says the emperor plucked all his body hair, wore wigs, painted his eyes, and offered his body to men in the palace. He claims Elagabalus would frequent the city's taverns and brothels, not as a customer, but as a worker, and that he even set aside a room in the imperial palace for prostitution. The most shocking claim is that Elagabalus sought out the best physicians in the empire, offering them vast fortunes if they could perform an operation to give him female genitalia. Now, we must be careful here. This is all filtered through the deep prejudice and disgust of a hostile Roman senator. Was Elagabalus what we would today understand as a transgender woman? Was his effeminate behavior part of the ritual practice of the Galli, the eunuch priests of the Eastern mother goddesses? Or was it all just vicious slander designed to paint him as the ultimate other? We will never know for sure, but what we do know is that for the Roman power structure, this behavior was the final, unforgivable sin. Eventually, even his clever grandmother, Julia Maesa, realized the situation was untenable. She needed a replacement, and she had one: Elagabalus's younger, quiet, and far more Roman-acting cousin, Alexander Severus. Maesa began promoting Alexander. Elagabalus, consumed by jealousy, saw what was happening. In a fit of paranoid rage, he stripped Alexander of his titles and spread a rumor that his cousin was dying to test the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. It was a fatal miscalculation. The guards, who had come to respect Alexander and utterly despised Elagabalus, went into open revolt. In March of 222 AD, the end came. Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Suemias, who had encouraged his every excess, panicked. They tried to flee, eventually hiding in a chest or, according to some sources, a latrine. It was no use. The enraged soldiers dragged them out. They killed the emperor and his mother on the spot. But their rage wasn't satisfied. They dragged the bodies through the streets of Rome. Finally, they tried to stuff the emperor's body into a sewer drain. When it wouldn't fit, they tied a weight to it and hurled it from a bridge into the Tiber River, so that he may never have a proper burial. He was 18 years old. His reign of religious terror was over. The Senate immediately damned his memory, and the sacred black stone of Emesa was quietly crated up and shipped back to Syria, never to be seen in Rome again. Was Elagabalus insane? Or was he simply a true believer? He failed to understand that you cannot force-feed a new reality to a city built on 1,000 years of tradition. His reign stands as one of history's most bizarre and extreme examples of a culture clash that left Rome shaken to its very core. We have seen madness that explodes. Caligula's reign was a bonfire of public spectacle. Commodus's was a festival of ego. Elagabalus's was a hurricane of religious fervor. Their insanities were loud, colorful, and impossible to ignore. They were public performances of a mind unhinged. But what if the most terrifying madness isn't the one that screams? What if it's the one that whispers? What if it's a quiet, cold, creeping paranoia that poisons an entire empire from the top down? This brings us to our number 2 pick, an emperor who wasn't a flamboyant performer, but a silent observer. A man whose craziness wasn't found in the arena or in an ecstatic dance, but in a dark room with a list of names. He represents a kind of bureaucratic terror, a systematic madness that made every citizen of Rome a potential suspect, and every whisper a potential death sentence. He is the emperor of fear, Domitian. Domitian's story, like so many of these, begins with a deep-seated insecurity. He was the younger son of Vespasian, the gruff, no-nonsense general who had seized power and founded the Flavian dynasty after the chaos following Nero's death. But all the glory, all the accolades, all the love went to his older brother, Titus. Titus was the handsome war hero who had conquered Jerusalem. He was charming, popular, and universally adored. Domitian was not. He was the awkward, brooding, resentful son left behind in Rome while his father and brother won their triumphs. He was tall, physically imposing, but socially withdrawn. He wrote poetry and craved recognition, but was constantly living in his brother's golden shadow. When his father Vespasian died, the throne passed, as expected, to the beloved Titus. Domitian was left on the sidelines, waiting, stewing in a potent cocktail of ambition and envy. Then, after a reign of only 2 years, Titus died suddenly of a fever. At last, in 81 AD, it was Domitian's turn. And here is the great, unsettling paradox of his reign. For a long time, he was an excellent emperor. He wasn't a fool or a playboy. He was a diligent, hard-working, and ruthlessly efficient administrator. He took his job seriously. He heavily patronized the arts and literature. He launched a massive building program to restore the temples and monuments of Rome that had been damaged in a recent fire. And he clamped down hard on corruption in the provinces. He personally presided over legal cases and was known for his strict sense of justice. He even raised the pay of the legions, securing their loyalty. On paper, he was everything a stable empire could want. But there was always a dark undercurrent, a chilling authoritarian streak. He despised the Senate and made no effort to hide his contempt for them. He insisted on being addressed not as princeps, first citizen, the traditional, humble title of the emperor, but as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Now we've seen Caligula want to be a god, but Caligula's divinity was a performance, a costume party of hubris. Domitian's was different. It was cold, bureaucratic, and absolute. It wasn't a request for worship. It was a demand for submission. It was a statement that he was not their equal, not their first citizen, but their master. This wasn't insanity born of delusion. It was the calculated implementation of autocracy. For the first half of his reign, this system worked. A competent, if feared, ruler managing the empire. But then, in 89 AD, everything changed. A general on the Rhine frontier, Lucius Antonius Saturninus, launched a revolt, proclaiming himself emperor. The rebellion was swiftly crushed. But for Domitian, it was a profound psychological trauma. The thing he had secretly feared all along, betrayal, conspiracy, the dagger in the dark, had actually happened. The threat was real, and so the quiet, brooding emperor unleashed a reign of terror so suffocating it would haunt the Roman aristocracy for a generation. His paranoia, once a private suspicion, now became the central organizing principle of the state. He empowered a network of professional informers, the delatores. These were men who made a living by accusing others of treason. They were rewarded with a cut of the condemned person's property. Suddenly, the entire city was a web of suspicion. A poorly worded joke, a private conversation overheard by a slave, a philosophical discussion about tyranny, even owning a map of the world, all could be twisted into a capital offense. Wills were scrutinized, with any perceived slight to the emperor leading to the execution of the family and the confiscation of their estate. No one was safe. He executed his own cousin, Flavius Clemens, on the vague charge of atheism and Jewish practices. He was killing his own family based on whispers. His cruelty became legendary, not for its explosive nature, but for its cold, psychological precision. The most famous story is that of his Black Dinner. Domitian invited a group of the most prominent senators and knights to the palace. When they arrived, they were led into a room that was painted entirely black. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. The dining couches were black. At each man's place, setting was a small column shaped like a tombstone, with his own name inscribed on it. Then, silent, naked young slaves, also painted black to resemble spirits of the dead, entered and performed a deathly dance before serving the guests a meal consisting of food traditionally offered to the dead. The senators sat in absolute, petrified silence, convinced this was their last night on earth. They were certain that at any moment the soldiers would rush in. Domitian watched them, savoring their terror. And then, after hours of this psychological torture, he simply dismissed them. He sent them home. Their carriages, which they thought had been confiscated, were waiting. Their terrified families were overjoyed to see them alive. Then a messenger from the palace would arrive at each man's house, but he didn't bring soldiers. He brought gifts, the very tombstone-like pillar with their name on it, now revealed to be a priceless silver candlestick, and the spirit slave who had served them, now offered as a personal gift. The message was clear. It wasn't just a sick joke. It was a demonstration of absolute power. "I can kill you whenever I want," Domitian was saying. "Your life is mine to give or take away. Never, ever forget that." It was madness weaponized into a tool of political control, his paranoia manifested in the very architecture of his palace. Suetonius tells us he had the walls of the porticos where he would take his daily walks lined with fengite, a highly polished, mirror-like stone from Cappadocia. Why? So that, as he walked, he could always see what was happening behind him. He lived his life in a hall of mirrors, constantly watching his own back for the assassin he was sure was coming. And then there's the most pathetic and unsettling image of all. Our sources say that he would spend hours every day alone in his room, doing nothing but catching flies and stabbing them with an exceptionally sharp stylus. When someone once asked if anyone was with the emperor, an attendant famously quipped, "Not even a fly." Think about that image. The Lord and God of the Roman Empire, the master of millions, a man consumed by such a deep-seated fear and a lust for control that he found satisfaction in the meticulous, solitary murder of insects. It's a portrait of a mind that has shrunk, collapsing inward on itself until only suspicion and petty violence remain. Of course, like all the others, Domitian's terror became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people he killed out of fear of conspiracy, the more he guaranteed that a real conspiracy would form out of sheer self-preservation. The final plot wasn't hatched by a rival general or an angry senator. It was born in the very heart of his own palace, among the people who saw his madness up close every single day. The conspirators included his own chamberlains, palace officials, and even, it is rumored, his wife, the Empress Domitia. The plan was set for September 18th, 96 AD. A palace steward named Stephanus, a man of great physical strength, wrapped his arm in wool bandages for days, pretending he had an injury. He was hiding a dagger inside. He gained an audience with Domitian, claiming he had a list of conspirators to reveal. As the emperor eagerly leaned in to read the list, Stephanus drew the hidden dagger and stabbed him in the groin. Domitian, a strong man of 44, didn't go down easily. He fought back, screaming for his servants. He grappled with Stephanus, trying to gouge out his eyes and beat him with a golden cup. But then the other conspirators, chamberlains, freedmen, even a gladiator, rushed in and overwhelmed him, stabbing him 7 more times. The Lord and God, the master of fear, died bleeding on his bedroom floor, killed by the very people he trusted most. When the news reached the Senate, they didn't mourn. They erupted in joy. They passed a full damnatio memoria, ordering his name to be chiseled off every inscription, his statues to be torn down and melted. They wanted to erase every trace of the man who had held them in a state of quiet, suffocating terror for 15 years. Domitian's madness was the insidious poison to Caligula's wildfire. It demonstrated that insanity doesn't always need to be flamboyant. Sometimes the most terrifying monster is the one who sits quietly in a room, making a list. We have reached the end of our countdown. We have seen madness in many forms, but there is one spot left. Our number 1 craziest Roman emperor. A man who managed to combine the divine megalomania of Caligula, the violent egotism of Commodus, and the paranoid cruelty of Domitian, and then added his own unique brand of artistic delusion to the mix. He is the emperor whose name is synonymous with tyranny, the one who fiddled while Rome burned. We have reached the pinnacle, the summit of insanity, the number 1 spot on our list of the craziest Roman emperors. We've seen the divine delusions of Caligula, the narcissistic fantasies of Commodus, the alien fanaticism of Elagabalus, and the cold paranoia of Domitian. Each was a monster in his own right, a unique flavor of a mind warped by absolute power. But our final emperor is different. He is the ultimate synthesis. He took the cruelty of Caligula, the ego of Commodus, and the paranoia of Domitian, and fused them into a terrifying new creation, adding a final, fatal ingredient: the desperate, preening vanity of a failed artist. He is the emperor who murdered his mother, his wife, and his tutor. The man accused of fiddling while his capital city burned to the ground, only to build a monument to himself in its ashes. He is the first great persecutor of the Christians, a tyrant whose death was celebrated as a liberation for the human race. Our number 1 craziest Roman emperor is, of course, Nero. Like so many others, Nero's reign began with immense promise. He was only 16 when he came to the throne in 54 AD, a handsome, artistically inclined young man. For the first 5 years, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, the empire was run beautifully. This was thanks to his 3 guiding hands: the brilliant Stoic philosopher and his tutor, Seneca, the tough, pragmatic Praetorian prefect, Varus, and most importantly, his fiercely ambitious mother, Agrippina the Younger. It was Agrippina who had schemed, murdered, and married her way into a position to place her son on the throne. She saw Nero not as the emperor, but as the instrument of her own power, and for a time he played along. But as Nero grew older, he began to resent her suffocating control. The power struggle between mother and son grew toxic, then deadly. This leads us to the single act that defined Nero's reign and shattered his psyche forever: matricide. He had to eliminate his own mother, but he couldn't just have her stabbed. It had to be clever. So he devised one of the most bizarre assassination plots in history. He commissioned a special collapsible boat. The plan was to invite Agrippina for a pleasant seaside dinner, then send her home on this boat. At a signal, the lead-weighted canopy would collapse, crushing her, and the boat itself would fall apart, sinking her into the sea. It would look like a tragic accident. The night came. The plan was put into action. The canopy collapsed, but Agrippina's couch was too strong, and it protected her. The boat began to sink, but the formidable 43-year-old woman, a true survivor, managed to swim through the darkness until she was picked up by a passing fishing boat. She knew instantly what had happened. She knew her son had tried to kill her. When Nero heard his plan had failed, he panicked. The mask was off. Now it was kill or be killed. He abandoned all pretense and sent assassins to her villa. As they entered her chambers, swords drawn, Agrippina faced them down. According to the historian Tacitus, she coolly bared her abdomen and said, "Strike here," pointing to the womb that had borne the monster who was now killing her. They cut her down. Nero was now free. But he was also haunted. The ancient sources say he was tormented by his mother's ghost, that he saw furies chasing him in his dreams. The murder of a mother was the ultimate crime, a stain on the soul that could never be washed away. This, historians argue, was the moment the good Nero died, and the monster was born. With his moral compass shattered, he began his long, slow descent. His obsession became public performance. Like Commodus, he craved the adulation of the crowd, but not for his strength, for his art. He saw himself as a world-class singer, poet, and above all, a chariot racer. He instituted a new festival, the Neronia, where he would force the social elite of Rome, the dignified senators and their wives, to sit for hours on end, forbidden to leave, while he performed on stage. The doors were locked. Men feigned death to be carried out. Women reportedly gave birth in the stands, rather than miss a single note from the divine emperor's lyre. His artistic tour reached its apex when he traveled to Greece, the home of the arts, to compete in the Olympic and other sacred games. He entered every musical and chariot racing competition. And, shock of all shocks, he won every single one. In one chariot race, he was thrown from his chariot and couldn't even finish the race, but the judges, terrified for their lives, declared him the victor anyway. He returned to Rome not like a conquering general, but like a conquering artist, celebrating a grand triumph with his 808 victory wreaths. It was a symphony of self-indulgence. Then, in the summer of 64 AD, came the catastrophe that would forever be linked with his name, the Great Fire of Rome. For 6 days, a monstrous fire swept through the crowded wooden heart of the city, reducing vast swathes of it to smouldering ash. The rumor, which started almost immediately, was that Nero himself had started it. The historian Suetonius claims he watched the inferno from a tower, dressed in theatrical costume, singing a song about the fall of Troy, famously, fiddling while Rome burned. Now, did he actually start the fire? Almost certainly not. But what he did next was far more damning. He used the disaster as a golden opportunity. In the vast, cleared-out space where the homes and tenements of central Rome once stood, he began construction on the most extravagant personal palace ever conceived, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This wasn't a palace, it was a private city. It covered hundreds of acres. It had a mile-long portico, vineyards, pastures with herds of animals, and an enormous artificial lake. The building itself was inlaid with gold and precious jewels. Its dining rooms had revolving ceilings that showered guests with flowers and perfumes. And in the entrance hall, he erected a 120-foot-tall bronze statue of himself in the guise of the sun god, Sol. He had wiped away a piece of Rome and replaced it with a monument to his own ego. But the populace was angry. They needed someone to blame for the fire. So Nero, in a move of cold political calculation, gave them a scapegoat, a small, obscure, and widely distrusted religious sect known as the Christians. What followed was a spectacle of horrific cruelty. Tacitus describes it in chilling detail. Some Christians were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were crucified. But Nero's special invention was to have them covered in pitch, tied to posts in his gardens, and set on fire to serve as human torches to illuminate his evening parties. It was an act of unimaginable sadism, designed purely to deflect blame from himself. The fire, the golden house, the persecutions, it was too much. The Roman elite had had enough. In 65 AD, a major conspiracy was formed, led by a senator named Gaius Calpurnius Piso. But the plot was discovered, and Nero's paranoia, which had been simmering for years, now boiled over into a full-scale reign of terror. He unleashed a purge. Senators and knights were forced to commit suicide. Among the victims was his old tutor, Seneca, who was ordered to kill himself, and did so with stoic dignity. But this wave of terror only bought him a few more years. By 68 AD, the empire was in open revolt. The legions in Gaul, in Spain, and in Africa all declared against him. The Senate, smelling blood in the water, finally found its courage and declared Nero a hostis, a public enemy, to be executed on sight. Nero found himself utterly alone. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him. His friends and slaves deserted him. He fled the palace in disguise to a small villa outside the city. There, cowering in a dirty room, he heard the hoofbeats of the soldiers coming for him. He tried to kill himself, but his nerve failed him. He had to have his loyal freedman, Epaphroditos, help guide his hand to plunge a dagger into his throat. His final words, uttered as he lay bleeding on the floor, are perhaps the most telling ever spoken by a tyrant. He didn't lament his lost empire or his victims. He lamented his lost talent. Qualis artifex pereo, he whispered, what an artist dies in me. Even in his final moments, his delusion was absolute. He was not a failed emperor, a monster, a murderer. He was a misunderstood artist. It is this complete, self-absorbed detachment from reality, combined with unimaginable cruelty and ego, that makes Nero the undisputed king of our list. And so our journey through the darkest corridors of the imperial palace comes to an end. From the divine monster Caligula, to the gladiator wannabe Commodus, the alien priest Elagabalus, the paranoid bureaucrat Domitian, and finally, the artist tyrant Nero. 5 men, 5 reigns, 5 unique portraits of madness. So what have we learned? We've learned that absolute power is perhaps the most corrosive acid that can be applied to the human mind. But was it always true, madness? Or was it sometimes a terrifyingly rational form of tyranny? The truth is, we will never fully know. The line between pathology and power is often impossible to draw. But the terror they inspired was real. The blood they spilled was real. These stories fascinate us thousands of years later, not just because they are shocking, but because they are cautionary tales. They are a timeless warning about what can happen when one person is given everything and is accountable to no one. They show us the fragility of civilization and the thin veneer of sanity that separates order from chaos. Thank you for joining us on this descent into the abyss here at the full history of the Roman Empire. Who do you think was the craziest emperor? Did we miss anyone on our list? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark side of history, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of the Roman world. Until next time, stay curious